Good morning, everybody. Once again, we are having our Center for Advanced Studies seminars on Zoom, but actually from Rijeka University. And as it was the case in on previous Thursdays, this Thursday we are welcoming our guest, Katerina Vrablikova, from Bath University, and our fellow Andrei Chisar will present Katerina, introduce the reason why we are all together at the moment, and we will hear Katerina lecturing us a few important moments from her book, after which we will engage in discussion. So please, Andrei, it's up to you now.
Okay, thank you. So the main reason why Katka is here with us is that she's a great scholar, of course. And I can say that because I have known her for a long time. We worked on many projects together. There is even now one project we are working together on. At present, she's, as you said, a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath, and her work focuses mostly on political participation, social movements, political attitudes, and culture of contemporary democracies. She also works on research methods and East European politics. Here, or today, she will focus on her book, What Kind of Democracy? She will share with us main findings of her research. This book is a rich empirical study, but at the same time, it has important theoretical implications. And I believe that she will focus exactly on these broader implications for our debates on kinds of democracy and different ways how we can understand democratic regimes. I think that that's it for the start, and the floor is yours, Katka, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you for this lovely introduction, and thank you very much for having me. This is a great honor to present at this seminar. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming or letting us into your living rooms and spending your time with us. I'm going to present, yeah, hopefully main parts of the book. This was not easy to prepare because, yeah, it's a whole book. But I'm going to structure it in a way that I'm first going to talk about the context of the question that I'm asking and the type of question and what I'm like aiming for with this type of question. Then I'm going to spend most of time, as Andrei suggested, on normative models of democracy, and we'll connect it to the theoretical implications of how democracy should work based on different types of models, so that we can have better, more functioning democratic structures. Then I'm going to show some empirical results, but this is going to be really quick and not intensive, and no tables, no numbers will be shown, I promise. And then I want to spend most of the second part on actually practical implications that we can draw from this for policy making and even for activism in our everyday life. Some basic rules that we can learn from this study that we can follow to improve democratic governance. So I'm gonna try to share my screen to show the PowerPoint that I prepared. Wait, so first I need to share the screen. Yeah, so and whenever you feel like you want to jump in, ask some question, or if I speak too fast or too whatever, let me know. And can I ask Andrei to let me know about time? Could you follow the time?
Of course, yes, yeah? Sure, yes.
So if you could do
And we are aiming at half an hour or something.
Yeah, so if you tell me at 20.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so this, and okay, there we go. Yeah, so this was supposed to be already on the screen, so I said that already. The question, where I'm coming from, what kind of democracy should we have and should we promote? So this question is based in a currently, I would say, really big debate that we can label a crisis of democracy debate. like there's like tons of works from people from different corners of social science, political theory, empirical research, people doing comparative politics, people focusing on like, I don't know, individual participation. Everyone kind of like contributes to this big debate on crisis of democracy. I personally don't want to see it from this perspective, because when we say that we have a crisis of democracy, it kind of implies some assumption that things were amazing until now. So I would like avoid this type of term. And also like in terms of empirical results or empirical evidence in terms of like how democracy is doing worldwide, I would be really careful, and we can talk more about that in the questions and answers if you want, about kind of like cherry picking that goes on in this field of literature, that if like we see some deteriorating trends in like some big democracies in the world, does not mean that it's happening everywhere, right? That it's, if it is like United States or the UK, we should not start like talking about a crisis of democracy if it is just like 3 or 4 countries. Nevertheless, I'm not saying that nothing is happening. We have empirical evidence that there's some type of political change and things are happening, things are changing. We see in some specific cases decline of democracy. We also see some kind of turbulences in terms of like changes of like standard or classical political alignments or party structures. We have a situation in Hungary, Brexit, Trump. So these things are happening. So this is like kind of like an opportunity to ask, oh, what shall we do? What is democracy about? Do we have like the big populist threat that democracy is not working, or are there some other things that are going wrong? I need to say before I started, this is like kind of like a timely thing to talk about, but my question is not about what is happening now compared to the past, but I'm more looking at what are some kind of like general mechanisms in democratic governance that we can follow and implement in various types of structures. So it can travel I don't know, across time, across countries. It can be in a context of small group participatory project, or in a context of a new democracy when we're designing political institutions. So it's more kind of like general mechanisms that can be like empirically realized through very different specific arrangements in different types of settings and contexts. So when I say that I'm talking, I don't know if you see that, yeah, because I have like your videos in the middle of the second slide. Well, okay, I will tell what is on the slide. When I'm talking about like better functioning democracy, what I mean is like that democracy is a rule of people, right? So that's the only criteria that I take here, because like, I mean, there's tons of like philosophical normative conversations around it that we can have, but basically the main argument is like that people are the like ultimate source of power. They're the only ones who know what's best for them, and we should not have anyone else telling people what they should want and what's good for them, right? So whatever, and I think like we can comfortably say that different forms of political thinking and normative positions that we start with, a lot of them end up in this position for different reasons, but that this will be the position why we need democracy as a rule of people. Okay, so my criteria when I say I'm like trying to come up with a model for a better functioning democracy is that I want democracy where people rule more and are more engaged in the participation on this rule. Specifically in this study, I'm looking at more engaged forms of participation on this rule, which I call non-electoral participation, but basically it's activities that go beyond participation in elections once or 4 years. I'm not saying in any case that elections are not cool. They are perfect, like, or not perfect, but they're like important element of like democratic governance. They have their role, but oftentimes we forget that there are things that happen in between and that are really important as well, because they kind of like intensify this communication between political elites and citizens, and kind of like provide more intense, more engaged, and more timely fashion of how people can take part in political participation and, you know, implement the rule of people. Okay, so what I'm specifically talking about is demonstrations, but not only petitions, boycotting, contacting politicians, all various kinds of ways how people can participate in politics. So my question is, what kind of democratic structures promote this type of people's involvement? That's the main question. And the justification is that this is the type of democracy that we should look for. I'm not looking for better governance. I'm not looking for efficient regime. I'm not looking for bigger economic productivity or other types of indicators. Just this one perspective, participation beyond elections. So what kind of democracy does that? What should we promote? So I created this kind of summary that basically is a summary of the whole book, and we're gonna spend some time working around this figure. So this figure shows a kind of like a grouping of different perspectives and models of democracy. Some of them are more kind of like empirical models of democracy. Some of them are more kind of like philosophical, normative origin, like it's like philosophers working on those types of forms of models of democracy. So I organize these different types of thinkings about democracy according to 2 dimensions, which is public contestation and the level of inclusiveness. And if you look at the inclusive consensus, I mean, I'm showing, you don't see that I'm showing, but inclusive consensus, top left corner, where we have deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, or communitarian or consensus democracy. We could also put social capital in there. That's the group of models of democracy that usually people would think of like, wow, that's the model. This is the one that we need if our goal is to have more engaged citizenry, have more like vibrant participation and people really participating in politics. That's the type of democracy and political structures that we need to implement because this will deliver this type of outcome. This type of, or these models of democracy, the main emphasis is on the fact that democratic structures need to be inclusive, which is a great point that I agree with, and there's nothing like controversial about it. And basically this point says that inclusion, or this inclusion as possible, as broad as possible, means that there is a wider scope of access for different types of interests, different types of people, different types of voices, and different channels, how they can enter the political system and voice their demands, right? So basically it means inclusiveness is about access and bringing people to the table, right? So if we don't even have certain groups of people at the table, then they are not participating, right? So they have to have a seat at this table when political decision making is happening. Next to inclusiveness, this model of democracy says that we also need consensus, which is the way how to like organize, you know, the table when the political participation is already happening. So from the perspective of, for instance, Leibhardt, who is like suggesting this like consensus or consensual model of democracy, his vision would be that consensus should, you know, be at place and cooperation instead of some rivalry or like escalation of conflict among political elites and some like adversarial relations when they're focusing on contestation. And he suggests that instead of that, it should be negotiation, cooperation, power sharing, and ultimately consensus. That's how he calls it. It's not only Leibhardt, but also, for instance, Jürgen Habermas in the concept of deliberative democracy, would, I'm sure all of you know about this much more than I do. It's all about consensus, right? Chantal Mouffe calls it inclusive rational consensus, right? So the basic idea is that, if we can like summarize it in a few sentences, is that the kind of like the power of interests and rivalry goes, you know, is pushed back at the expense of power of reason and deliberation, that it's like the power of the argument that is brought to this deliberation moment. And then if we talk enough and well, then we can reach some consensus, even if it would be consensus about something that we disagree about. What would be, yeah, some like third thinker that could fall under this, more like in terms like of like empirical applications, would be Robert Putnam, who is promoting this idea of like social capital. And this is really big, not so much in democratic theory, but in democratic promotion and policy making. And this is like a golden word that is written in most of like policy making, democracy promotion and democracy building type of documents. And the idea behind social capital is that it's based on networks, mutual cooperation, trust, reciprocity, and all these kind of like what I call like niceness feelings, that that people feel connected and cooperate, and out of this cooperation then we will get all these like benefits and good results that people are engaged more in politics. My argument is that instead of consensus, we don't need consensus, but we need contestation, which is the second line of the table. And this kind of brings to the perspective like a third model of democracy that groups together models that you probably know, like polyarchy, pluralist perspectives of democracy, agonistic democracy of Chantal Mouffe, or counter-democracy of Rosa Valon, or Robert Dahl, and like pluralist, neo-pluralist type of thinking. So going back to the map, so I forgot to say that like at the very bottom, we also have like elitist, minimalist democracy, which would be like this like a majoritarian democracy that is based on competition. And this would be like some people would connect it with like a American view of democracy. And I'm not gonna really talk about that one because this model does not even pretend that they are aiming in a more engaged citizenry. So like the extreme in this camp would be Schumpeter, right? Who's like elitist Democrat, and it's like, okay, elites compete, and it's better if people don't even involve because many other reasons why they're not so good at being Democrats. So my point is that we should be promoting the right top corner that combines inclusiveness. So everything that I said about access and having different voices and a wide variety of interests and demands at the table applies. But instead of consensus, I'm saying that we need contestation. And the reason for that is that contestation and rivalry among political elites spur the mechanism of political accountability, which kind of like puts pressure on politicians and means that politicians will be more responsive and representative to the people, right? And this pressure that politicians are under pressure, they need to compete for people, to like them and support them, means that they're gonna be motivated to deliver a better job and achieve what they promised, and that they're gonna actually represent specific groups of people. From like empirical perspective of like, oh, why should that increase political participation? It means that it's gonna increase the chances of success for people, right? So if there are clear structures of accountability and representation, people see that with them sitting at the table, it's also going to deliver. So not only that they can voice their problems, but that their voices will also be heard, right? So this increases the chances of success for people, and this, according to the participation theory, should motivate them to participate more in politics. So the crucial moment here is that compared to consensus models of democracy, this model of democracy has this accountability mechanism that is the trick that brings people to participate, right? From this perspective, there's nothing wrong with consensus, but these models of democracy don't have this mechanism, right? And there is nothing that would really assure that political elites will be responsive, and if people participate, that they will get the things that they participate for, okay? Another problem, more kind of like a normative problem that I have with the like inclusive consensus models of democracy, in a nutshell, basically means that it's kind of like a silencing, all right? Because like, I mean, if you can apply all the critiques that like from Chantal Mouffe about Habermas or Rawls, that basically it means that, okay, at the name of consensus and agreement, basically we need to silence someone, right? And it's kind of like a tricky way that it means that someone who is bringing adversarial positions or is in like strict conflict is not really helping. So they're the bad guy in the system. And also it means that people need to kind of like sacrifice for like a common good of the community. but who specifies what the common good of the community is, right? So, and then like in extreme versions, we can think of like a general will or common good, or some people would even like lighter versions would be like good governance, right? But okay, good governance, like that we have functioning railway system, that's cool, but who told us that this is the thing that everyone wants, right? So there's just kind of like a normative problem with this, that actually it can be really like a good political, like abused as a political strategy for silencing of certain types of voices at the end of the day, and disattachment of political elites from individual citizens. And there are empirical studies that look at, for instance, like consensual democracy, like the Leibhardt's type of political structures that show that really this effect happens, that over the time in consensual democracies, elites, because there's not so much pressure on them, kind of get disattached from ordinary citizens, don't really represent them well, because they kind of like create like some elite clique on top. And in the name of, yeah, we need to have consensus, they do their own thing and don't really represent the ordinary people. So these are the general principles. I'm showing it on some type of data, but you can find it in different types of literatures. I think the most I've seen it in literature that is focused on participatory institutions. So they don't use this language that I'm using here about like inclusiveness and contestation, but these like qualitative studies of like this like participatory institutions in Latin America would describe like from qualitative exploratory type of research point of view, similar processes, that they would see these participatory institutions where it was more kind of like let's agree, let's hope for the best, did not really work well, that people were not so much engaging because the results of those projects were not really like accountable, that things really happen as people agreed on them, and there were no clear rules how to voice conflict and how to compete among different demands that people had. Whereas systems were what they called like systems of countervailing power, where there was like a clear structure of, okay, who is gonna do what after what, if we agree here, our politicians gonna do it, and those were the participatory institutions that worked really well. So just to summarize, the main argument is that I'm saying that structures that implement inclusiveness and contestation are gonna increase political participation beyond elections, because inclusiveness provides access to people. So there are various points for various types of people to come to the political system. Whereas contestation motivates people because it promises and provides higher chances of access. That if they participate, that it can really matter. That political elites will listen, because there is higher, thanks to the contestation and the fact that they have to compete, higher accountability and representativeness of political elites. So my empirical application that I'm doing is on comparative data. So I'm looking at differences across countries. Okay, I'm gonna explain this in a minute. Stay here for a while. So I'm taking it like not from participatory institutions in some city, but I'm looking at empirical realizations of those principles in like structures of national politics. And I'm looking at formal political institutions, then we can go, which is like power separation and power sharing institutions. And I will explain in a second how these different types implement the two different logics. And I'm also looking at the political culture. So my unit of analysis is a country, and I'm trying to explain how the political participation in non-electoral politics differs across those countries. So in this, basically, you see the general summary of the like theoretical model and how things are done in this study. So if you forget about the top part for now and look only at the bottom part, you basically see like a standard classical model of how we explain why people participate in politics, because they have some socio-demographics that make it easier for them to participate. They have more resources, education, and so on. There are some mobilizing networks. This is this like nobody asked type of explanation, that people will participate in non-electoral participation politics if there's like some recruitment going on, that they're provided the opportunity and someone recruits them, either networks or politicians. The third group of classical predictors is like attitudes and values, which basically says that you have to have some types of opinions and norms that lead you to participation, like political interest, political efficacy, or norms of citizen duty, or feeling that you are like critical towards politicians and so on. So the primary level of these things is they're measured at the individual level and they operate at the individual level, right? So they explain really well differences, why, like, I don't know who lives in the UK as well in this group, but why I would participate more than someone else living in the UK. But they don't really explain well why we have so much more participation in countries like Sweden, UK, not UK, Sweden, US, a little bit less in the UK, and much less in countries like Bulgaria, Czech Republic, or Portugal. The explanation, as I will show, comes from my theory that I operationalize on this case at the level of political systems. And this is what you see at the top box of the slide. So I'm looking at these two main competing models of democracy, this inclusive contestation, that's the one that I like, that's the like Chantal Mouffe and Robert Dahl, agonistic democracy and polyarchy. The other one is inclusive consensus, that's the dominant one, that is like this like Habermasian.
20 minutes gone, okay.
20 minutes gone, perfect. Yeah, nice.
20 minutes gone. Yeah.
I'm doing well, okay.
Don't worry, you
cool.
have your time.
Yeah, perfect. So I can speak slower, good. So where was I? Oh yeah, inclusive consensus. So this would be these models of democracy like social capital, deliberative democracy, consensual democracy, participatory, this kind of like communitarian vision on democracy. So the way how I operationalize them in terms of political institutions, so there's like this big debate on like formal political institutions in the state, how they should be organized. And there are two big groups that we can call power separation and power sharing. And power separation basically means logic of checks and balances. We just summarize it with two words. So it means that there's like a dispersion in the political structures and the political institutions in the given country, that we have like independent, separate bodies of like power centers in the political system that are not connected, right? And the trick is that their job is to be separate and their job is to watch and balance each other, right? So this would be, for instance, vertical decentralization, like federal structure, right? That you have like a federal level, then you have a state level, then you have regional levels, right? They have very different sources of political legitimacy. They were, I mean, and that's the like whole, you know, founding fathers of American Constitution. That's the whole purpose why it's been done like this, right? That they have different source of political legitimacy, so that they are not tied together, and their job, constitutional job, is to, you know, watch one another and compete. And this implements the logic of access and inclusiveness of one hand, right? Because in one hand, it creates like plenty of access points for people to enter the political system, but also it creates these dynamics of political accountability and high representation, because these are like constantly fighting and trying to represent better their constituency. So they should produce a high responsiveness, and they should motivate people to participate more in politics. Whereas power sharing institutions, the power sharing institutions, this is those that like Leibhardt talks mostly about when he talks about like decentralization. Those are institutions, the best example is multi-party government, where the idea is like, let's do decentralization in a form of sharing, right? That we kind of have this like what we call like joint accountability and responsibility, that we sit together, negotiate, cooperate, and come up with some solutions that are good for the largest number of people, right? Great on the paper, but the risk with this type of power decentralization is that the actors that are supposed to represent different groups of society kind of like get blurred together. Then over time they develop this kind of like joint responsibility, collegiality, and also like in institutional terms, they're seen as like one body, and they're forced to be cooperative, like negotiate and like work together in like a consensual, like nice way, instead of like being critical to one another and competing with one another, right? So this should produce this moment of like when these elites that starts as big rivals kind of come closer together, which means that they are disattaching from the base that they should be representing. Yeah. Although these institutions provide access, that there are different parties in the coalition government, it doesn't have this moment of accountability and increases chances of success. In terms of political culture, this is the second line in the bottom box. I'm distinguishing and drawing on like a large amount of like this like a classical political cultural literature that has come up with these. That's not my invention, okay? I'm just like stealing it from them. That came up with those different forms of political culture. On one hand, we have this self-expressive culture that you might know as like post-materialism. And this basically says that in a society, there is a large amount of people who have this kind of like assertive, critical citizen type of attitude, right? Those are people who are like politically confident. They think that they can have a say in politics and want to be involved in politics, and are kind of like more demanding and critical towards authorities in general. In terms of politics, it means political authorities, like political parties and presidents and so on, right? And the basic idea is here that if there is like enough people in the population and they are usually positioned in like a high social status levels of the society, it means that it kind of gets diffused to the political system, and it kind of like normalizes this kind of assertive culture that disagreement, demanding more, and being critical of politicians is normal, right? It's normalized. So in these types of culture, if you go to do protest, you're not called a terrorist. How dare you to question the president, or right to disagree with the government or something like this? This is like internalized normal thing and good thing, and supported and promoted. Whereas in collective social capital, this is like Putnam's version of social capital, there we have nothing about these accountability cultural mechanisms. It's all focused on cooperation, reciprocity, mutual aid, and networks. Yeah, and I'm using like survey data in this like multi-level model and run the analysis. Magic, and this is the results. Basically, yeah, there's like the graphical presentation of the results. I do like different types of versions of like how I play with the models and test like more specific observable implications. But this is the main result, basically saying that the two indicators, cultural and institutional, of inclusive contestation increases individual likelihood to be involved in non-electoral politics when we control for these all other things that I showed on the previous slide, like your political interest or share people with education in a given country and so on. Whereas the indicators of inclusive consensus in this empirical study, it's power sharing institutions and social capital don't do that. You know? I'm also like showing that, for instance, this same logic operates for recruitment. So if we look at like how people are recruited and mobilized into political participation through their like membership networks or political discussions, this is also increased in inclusive contestation type of context and not in inclusive consensus context. Important thing to say before I go to the application, to the policy making implications, is that I'm not saying that inclusive consensus is bad per se. You see that it's on the red line. I'm saying it does nothing. For the purpose that we want to have more engaged citizenry, it's not doing anything. It won't harm, but it won't do any good, right? The point is that if you want to increase this, you need to implement some structures and institutions and cultures that promote inclusive contestation. So I'm talking like big about like political systems, right? And political culture, and how can we manipulate this? We probably don't have like in our life a chance to design a new country and completely change the constitution. But there are some lessons we can learn from this. Maybe if there are like some projects that like promote democracy, or there are like some opportunities for constitutional change, this could be the moment when to think of this specific arrangement. Or in terms of self-expressive culture. We know from Englehart that self-expressive culture should be a result of basically economic development, meaning welfare state, right? So if we think of policies in terms of like, yeah, we need like the broadest amount of population growing up in like material and physical security, and thanks to that they're able to do this kind of process that Engelhardt talks about, that, you know, they can start thinking about like non-material things and focusing on like self-realization and self-expression. This would be the way how we can support this and develop more self-expressive culture in given countries. But yeah, as we know, this goes through generations, so this is like something that would have like effects in like 60 years or whatever. But what does it mean for participatory policymaking? It's like a big business, I need to say. It's not really connected to the academic literature, but there's like plenty of money going to specific, like different types of projects that are aimed at increasing political participation. But those projects don't, as normal, I guess, with policymaking, don't really talk to the findings from the academic literature, and it's kind of like world for itself. So here we have like 3 main groups of those policies. The first one that I think has the biggest amount of money given to is education for participation, right? So these projects are like these like citizen education programs that are like run by NGOs or like civic centers, but also like at schools, right? And those will be programs where the idea is like, oh, the problem why people don't participate is that they don't know enough about political system, or they don't know how to speak to politicians, or they don't know how to organize. So let us teach them and like equip them with those resources and capacities so that they can do that, right? The problem that I see with this approach is that it sees the problem only on the part of the citizens, right? And when we think of it more, it's like oftentimes people don't participate not because they would not have the resources, right? At the end of the day, this cost and benefit at the individual level is kind of like, yeah, it's not so difficult to go to demonstration, right? If you want to apply it on like what's happening like currently now, right? You just go and people just show up, right? And it's not about that you're not educated enough, right? I mean, this is like more complex process, but what I want to say is that it forgets that there is also other element, and that in some contexts, it actually makes sense not to participate. Even if you score high on, and you're like PhD political scientist, if you're in a system that is not gonna deliver when you participate, why would you, right? That would be irrational. The second type of policymaking is civil society building. And this has been mostly done in like this like democracy promotion, like new democracy building. And I'm sure in Eastern Europe, you know, like you were aware of this. We had that a lot in the Czech Republic, where basically the idea was like, we're gonna have a good democracy if we're gonna fund civil society and have like a robust, strong civil society, which at the end of the day meant NGOs funded by foundations or the EU or the state. This is a topic for itself, and we can have another discussion whether this can really, it worked or not. But from the perspective of my book, the problem with this approach is that there is still some context that the civil society organizations need to operate in. And I think like currently Hungary and Poland are great examples of this, why, hey, maybe we need to think about the wider context and the setup of the political institutions in the given country. Even if we had like super strong civil society, maybe this is not gonna save the day. Once they're confronted with non-working, non-accountable political institutions. The third one is participatory institutions, and I've already told you about this, that like this is like the most recent and biggest like kind of like a fashion thing in a participatory policymaking, to do kind of like these participatory projects like this like negotiation tables or participatory budgeting or these like council meetings. And those are amazing things, but if you're into this, like keep in mind that they differ widely in how they look and what they do. And qualitative studies on implementation of those can show that in some instances, it's basically worse than better, because it's sometimes used as like a legitimization manipulation by political elites, right? Let's do some kind of consultative body. Let's invite people from the city to ask what they want. And it will be just like what this literature calls like selective listening. If the people happen to tell what the political elites want to hear, then yeah, amazing. This was participatory, nice experience. But if this does not happen, then the voice of people is not listened to, and then we have the problem of like lack of accountability and responsiveness. But there are examples where it works great. So the last slide, do I have a few minutes? Yeah, perfect. So what can we do like practically? So I have like at the end of the book, I kind of came up with like 5 rules that we can ask when we like design or want to do like some participatory, like democratic participatory situations. So if, I don't know, if you're in some activist group or if you would be in some other situation where you need to know that. So this should be some kind of like a manual that should help navigate the situation. So the first rule is that we need to always ask that and be aware that context matters, right? So even, I'm not saying that like this education for participation projects are bad. That like some of them are really good if they're like targeted on really like underprivileged types of society and social groups, and they can really help a lot. But we need to keep in mind and ask, does this specific thing I'm doing make sense in the context, right? Because my feeling is that with a lot of those participatory projects, it's like as if you had like a house where you would be building like really super high-tech heating, but did not have walls on the house, right? So you're like focusing and fixing something small somewhere, but the general structure of the thing is not there. So you might be wasting resources and even like alienating people and like wasting like a potential for the future to get them involved. The second point is that political inclusiveness is necessary. I did not really talk that much about it because it's like kind of like everyone agrees with that, but this is really crucial, right? And that's what all political participation literature and all this like either inclusive consensus or inclusive contestation model emphasize and take for granted. We need to be inclusive, right? And not inclusive only that we think, oh, we have everyone, but really actively asking if someone is not silenced, right? Because like silencing is like one of a great political strategies, how to get rid of your opponents. So you, I don't know, call someone racist or something like this, and you say, oh, you don't have a place at the table and you can't speak, so you're excluded. So that's one way, but it doesn't have to be only like intentional. Like most of political participation literature is focused on this like systemic structural inequalities where certain groups of society are systematically long-term excluded from politics. And our job is to ask who is it and really try to actively bring them so that they are included in the discussion. The third point is that we need explicit mechanisms of political accountability, right? So basically you can ask or play like experimental situation in your head. How can opposition views be successful under the system of functioning that we, for instance, have in our group, right? So I don't know, like in my political organizing, like when we start, like we're doing now like mutual aid groups. So when we start that, we of course start from like certain point of view of like-minded people. And then it's always good to ask, so if we have like new people coming into the group, will they have tools to really say something that we don't like and push it through and implement it as a result of like the functioning of the group? It's always good to like ask this, and if you don't have that, making sure that there is mechanism where people can not only push through conflicting demands, but that it's also like normalized and seen as a normal way or like a normal thing to do. Fourth point is encourage political contestation, and basically this means that disagreement is normalized, right? That there are comfortable ways and structures that even like structured the type of interaction among the actors or individual people, that it's normal to disagree, voice conflict, and that it's like something that is not seen as like, I don't know, damaging the group or like going against the goal of the project or something like this. Yeah. The fifth point is like, yeah, being suspicious against consensus. And basically this talks to this like debate about like, you know, what I've mentioned before, like this kind of like totalitarian tendencies of consensus, that where there is too much agreement and we don't see any opposition, it's probably not a sign that things are great, but a sign that someone is silenced or co-opted or didn't even have a chance to speak, right? Like the people are different, interests are inherently different. Of course, there will be disagreement if you had at least two people. I mean, sometimes even like one person has disagreements in themselves, right? So it's like normal to have disagreement. If you don't see that, that's really a warning sign. So again, the message is like that disagreement and rivalry, conflict can be seen or should be seen as a productive thing. And maybe even in your own organizing, don't get like sad when people disagree, because it's like normal and productive thing, making your own organizing better and more democratic. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for patient listening. I will stop sharing my screen, and yeah, happy to discuss further.
Super, thank you very much. I enjoyed it myself very much, but I think that I'm not going to start with my questions, because I have many, but I'd leave to Andre to moderate the discussion and even start asking questions.
Okay, I can do that for sure. Thank you for this presentation. While you were talking, I was also going through this book again, and I have to say that it's really a great book, so I recommend everybody to read it. And so I'm familiar with the book and with the material which is used there, and the question which I have is going beyond the material in the book. I would like to ask about the current situation and whether we can apply or use this framework which was just been presented here to help us understand what's going on in current democracies. What I have in mind more concretely is like very different types of protests. For example, Yellow Jackets movement in France, or current protests in the United States. These are, like, if I use your perspective, then we can, I think, there are different protests, but using your perspective, we can say that these protests are definitely articulating problems and feelings of discrimination of alienated parts of population, or people who feel that their position is somehow discriminated against in the wider society. And these are also very different countries. So, like, you know, if I use your theory in the United States, this is different type of political institutions than France, which is completely different, like this decentralized model based on checks and balances in the United States versus much more centralized model of governance in France. Like, these two countries are usually used in these debates as two polar examples of how democratic political institutions can be arranged. And I have just like very simple question. Can we, or are you able to discuss these protests, this current situation, like with the help of your theory? And is it possible to, you know, help us understand what's going on today using your conceptual tools? I hope that it's not too difficult.
Another hour. Should I answer or collect questions?
I think that you can react now, and then we will move on. Yeah.
So, so I start with the first disappointment. So France does not really fit the model. So, yeah. No. First, I also want to say that, yeah, that also thanks to Andre. I think I never really had the chance to say thank you, because you really helped me with the book, and especially with the normative chapter. I think you spent a lot on that, so it has like a lot of your comments in it, which I'm not like getting rid of responsibility, but like, yeah. Yeah, so going to France, yeah, France is like empirically does not fit. So there are like few outliers that don't follow the general rule. And this is like a thing about like France, just what the stats says, France is weird. And we kind of know it also, right? And this is really interesting, because like France is really weird because they have like plenty of protests and plenty of participation, but their level of like this like formal political institutions is completely opposite than it should be, right? According to my theory. And also their self-expressive culture is not like nothing amazing that would be able to balance this. So France doesn't really fit into that. The reason for it, I have like a little bit on that in the book, is that basically France developed like a different, that we don't only have like formal political institutions that can like implement and embody this like mechanisms that I'm talking about, and that like like a historical literature, or and specifically like Pierre Rosanvallon talking about that France actually is very much like public contestation type of regime, but this is not happening thanks to the like constitutional design that I am measuring with my stats, but it's happening like informally because of historical think of legacies, and that basically the different like social groups and like activist groups in the society kind of take on the role of these like different like I don't know, in the US we would say, oh, we have constitutional court and this and that, but in France it's the groups of the society and the tradition of the mobilization that takes on this role of doing this like a accountability representativeness type of pressure thing in a French system. I know, sneaky answer to this, yeah. Like in terms of what it means for today's protest, and like what we see now, that there are like very different types of voices being communicated through protest today. And I was like, I had a little bit like a feeling that you're also pointing at like yellow vests, and like that there might also be like not this kind of like super nice protest that we always would love to have, right? And some people would also talk about it in like a sense of like, oh, look at Hungary, this is like, there is a lot of political participation and protest and they're mobilized, but they're not the good guys. So like the perspective in my book basically says there are no good and bad guys, right? So basically it's the like Chantal Mouffe type of perspective, that what matters is that things get voiced, and that it doesn't mean that we have to agree with them, and it doesn't mean that you cannot stage come to protest and like throw water at them, but that we don't distinguish these like good and bad guys, this kind of like liberal silencing type of approach, that we want participation only when it's good, right? So like from the perspective of my theory, it's like when things are getting activated and heated, the better, because this means that they're gonna be addressed and there's gonna be some contestation. And this contestation does not happen only at the level of, oh, we are the people versus the elites, right? The crucial starting point is that the people differ, right? It's not like artificial difference at the level of political elites. It's that we are different. It's not like that Trump is crazy and pushing something. I mean, there is 40% at least of people in the US who want some of those things, right? It's not that he came up with something that would not exist in the population, right? And the result is that we can't shoot those people, right? If we want to have democracy, we need to somehow come up with like the way how these things get processed, and that we like survive together. And the idea is that, yeah, that we get politically active and fight for the thing, for the side that you are on, and hoping for the best that your side will win. The argument that would say, oh, but it's not really good because like this starts this like some like this like a cycle of never ending participation, but that's actually the point. That's what democracy is about. And it's not like that one day things are done and we can sit and rest and not be politically engaged, because like grievances, interests are ever present, always be there, people will always disagree, and we need to get involved. Did it answer a bit what you wanted to hear?
Yes, for sure. You discussed that, so that was it. Thank you. Okay. And now I can see Sean Henley, who is with us here. Welcome, Sean. Who would like to ask the next question? And Guillermo is the next one.
I did hear you at the start, by the way. I couldn't sort out my screens. Okay. Yeah, it's a really interesting presentation, and I have a couple of questions, Katerina. I sort of wonder if you could sort of slightly tell us the story of the book. Because at the start you say something about democracy, and you say, I don't see it as being in crisis, and you say something to the effect of, it's not what's going wrong, it's what's going on, or something like that. So I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because you kind of jumped over that point and it was really interesting. And then my other sort of question is to do with what democracy is for. So you kind of say that it's about kind of controlling elites and making elites accountable. And this, as I think your answer just suggested, kind of runs in parallel with the populist critique of democracy, which I don't mean as a criticism, because I think it should be taken more seriously. But on the other hand, you stress contestation and sort of pluralism, and you seem to have this view of a very sort of pluralistic diverse kind of society. And I just wonder if there isn't a sort of tension there. And my final point is that there's obviously a potential for contestation to become polarization. And so really, how do you avoid a sort of populist dynamic within civil society? Because one of the more interesting aspects of the populism literature is that it doesn't just happen in elections, it happens in society, and it happens sort of culturally. So I just wondered if you could sort of talk through those points.
Thank you. You have great background.
Yeah, it's Star Wars. Yeah, you don't want to see my bedroom, so it's a Death Star. I've gone over to the dark side.
Yeah, and yeah, those are amazing questions. Like, I mean, I think you nailed all problematic points. Yeah, I'm gonna start with the first one. So this like talk about crisis of democracy. It's not really so much in the book. I made it at the beginning here to make it like more relevant to current debate, because the book came out like already like 3 years ago, and this kind of like crisis of democracy was not such a big deal yet at that time. So I can talk like, so there's no more in the book, but I can say more about it now. Is that I think there's like this like a perspective. What I said at the beginning, that this kind of like literature on like crisis of democracy has this perspective of like that there used to be some standards that we thought that things are great and now it's bad, but it might not have been, like particularly I don't like deterioration of democracy in Eastern Europe. Like that a lot of my feeling is that like a lot of indicators of democracy that we look at or emphasize don't really measure the quality of democracy. So I know, especially in Eastern Europe, like the fact that like a lot of people took like signs of like stability, like of like volatility and like stable party systems, or like that things are not turbulently changing and are stable as a sign that democracy is working well. But I think it was totally like a mistake. And as I would say, what the processes that are happening today, it actually was the other way around, that there was like some top-down elite-led something called democracy, but those things were not really based in like rule of people, that it would go through this like, and here I would like draw on like this like Tilly's distinction between like these two like ways of democratization. So like what Tilly, and I think someone Dimitrova, I don't know the name of the author specifically, but wrote like really great article about interpreting like democratization in Eastern Europe, saying that it actually was not really democratization, because it was like top-down implanted thing where elites had agreement on something, what they call democracy, and it didn't really go through the process of like, you know, rule of the people, like, which is like slow. Tilly would describe it like over centuries in the UK, right? Slow process of that is not about let's make the big structures, but it's like about like this like everyday struggle between masses and elites, and this like permanent contestation is the way how democracy gets born. And I think this is not a perspective, I mean, it kind of combines like this realist perspective of democracy as conflict, but also has this like populist argument, like going to your other question. Yes, this kind of is populist, because I mean, of course, there are like some bad populists, but they have a point. You can't have democracy without people. And the fact that people are, I don't know, voting for Orban or for Trump is not their fault, but it's a fault of, from my perspective, it's a fault of political elites who are not accountable and responsive enough to these social groups. I don't know where I'm going now with that. Yeah, so like the crisis of democracy, so I would be more kind of like I don't know, a lot of this literature, I think, comes from this kind of like a liberal consensus type of perspective that, oh, we have some Western values that we agreed on, and this is the most important thing, and now it's being challenged, that there are also like other things that we should care about, like, I don't know, colonialism and other types of grievances. And these critiques come from both sides, right? Like from radical left and radical right. So that would be my position. Yeah, and the tension between polarization, that when contestation becomes too much, that's really a thin line, right? And this would be like involved like in also like this like philosophers talking about it, like Chantal Mouffe, where the line is like the violence, right? And this is where we have to keep it. But I think keeping it closer to the line is, from the long-term perspective, safer than neglecting it completely and having no contestation and no conflict, because then the stuff is gonna accumulate and gonna like explode later on in a form of huge polarization, right? So instead of like this like lighthearted and like, oh, let's pacify and like play down the conflict, in long term won't work, because there will be different generations and we can't, you know, they are there and they should be addressed by this kind of like contestation that happens within democratic structures, so that they don't overrun into like some conflictual polarization that actually would be the result that Leibhardt wants to argue against, right, or save us from. But I think the paradox is like that the medicine that he's suggesting in long term might actually lead to what he is afraid of. What was it? Did I answer everything, or was there something more?
Right. No, I think that really covers it in an interesting way. I just wanted to comment very quickly. There's people and there's the people, which just occurred to me, because you stress people, and of course, if you're a populist, you believe in the people, and I'm just wondering whether maybe that's a sort of useful distinction we could bear in mind. I don't know if you maybe all know Albert Weil's book about the will of the people. It's a kind of short book where he's very critical of the whole notion that this can mean anything. So maybe you need maybe there's a sort of notion of people-centeredness, but not the people with a capital T. Yeah, no, that covers it. I'll be quiet.
Okay, thank you, Sean, for your comment. And now we have 3 people on the list: so Guillermo, Christina, and Tanya. So Guillermo, please.
Okay, well, thanks for this presentation and for this very dynamic way of speaking. I love to see people thinking through their stuff. And I would like to keep going on this accountability. Can we include through accountability the result or practical impact, if it makes any sense, of how much what we wanted to voice out through our participation, actually, whether this participation, whether our voicing our concerns change the status quo in such a way that we are, we feel like we did something. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that, maybe we have to review the graph you show on the impact of different conceptions, and maybe we can also fill the empty gap of exclusive consensus, which was missing. Mm-hmm. Because probably the one that want to exclude people have money, and they can achieve a lot in terms of results. Even, I don't know, the super alone exclusivist that owns a lot of money can kind of voice his concerns, and he has millions of values, or I don't want to say dollars because it's polarizing the stuff towards some stuff. So yeah, if we factor this in, probably the graph looks better for some proposals which are not yours, which I personally think it's bad, and also makes more relevant probably those sort of person which we are not, which, I mean, there are no bad guys in your book, but probably they look a little bit less nicer than the rest of the guys in the book. So is this a legit move, or how can I be wrong with that? I mean, I don't want the graph to be reshaped such that voicing all, try to voice all instances is a bad thing. So please help me in proving me wrong, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, that was a great comment. If I understand correctly, so and also going back to Sean's point, so what I propose won't probably bring revolution, right? This system will not bring big social change or quickly, right? Because like the whole logic is based on like this like pluralist view, that it's like this accountability confrontation, but not only versus like the people and the elites, but also like among people, right? And that's the fact that exists. And unless we move to something that I guess like, I mean, I personally don't want, then we start shooting the Trump supporters, or, you know, then we need to accept the fact that if we want to do things in democratic way, this kind of like bargaining and permanent contestation will be like moving from, you know, by small steps. And like sometimes people say like, and it kind of like represents like the American structure of democracy, that like stuff doesn't get done and that it helps like the status quo. But from, I would argue that it like at the end of the day it's slower, not so efficient. Big changes can't be implemented quickly, but like I think it's like a good thing because it prevents us from a lot of dangers that a lot of people warn about, right? Like abuse of power and like domination of one group of people over another, and like silencing of minorities and so on. So this will, I mean, it is democratic. It will assure that people will participate more, but it will not bring quickly big social change. But my point would be like, it will bring it on like solid grounds, step by step, long term, because it will be based on these like everyday contestations over everything, instead of like one strong power player coming to the game and changing everything. And you totally identified it well. This is what would be said, that it's like the strength of some of the other models, right? The exclusive contestation is definitely this type of model, right? If you win in this system, then you have really like a lot of capacity to make big changes and like change the politics a lot. The exclusive consensus, I didn't give it a name because I don't think it's really democracy. So I know it's weird to have like a 2x2 table, but then talk only about 3 models of democracy. But the counterpoint of this, it means like, oh, we don't want people to be heavily involved, and it's based on that, like that not even like conflict and disagreement among elites is not supported. So for me, this would even be like a non-democratic type of like direction for this model. Do you have some other question, or did it answer what you wanted? Cool. Yeah, I mean, like in terms of like emotions, for you to feel better, I'm also like super disappointed that the revolution will not come, but or like in a way, like how I propose, but also like for my own activism, it's like, yeah, if things take long and it feels like that we have endless meetings and we're going nowhere because we need to hear everyone and implement every step, then it's probably a sign that we're doing it right.
Okay, thank you. Now we have here a suggestion from Sean that exclusive consensus could be this technocratic populism, but
sounds great. Yeah.
But let's move to the next one with Christina, who would like to ask a question.
Hi, Katerina, and thank you a lot for this interesting presentation. I didn't have a chance to read your book before. So I am curious and would like to know a little bit more about methodology. What kind of data did you use? How did you collect it? And what kind of analysis you have done?
Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I really like this question because I'm a big fan of the method part of it.
You too.
So, you too. So I basically, this was actually my dissertation, and I did not really have like money to do some other type of research, right? So I had to rely on existing data. So I used like comparative surveys that were already out there, and I used ISSP 2004 citizenship that has like a good balance between like, because like for the analysis I'm doing, I need like a lot of countries. So they cover a lot of countries just like beyond ESS, like European Union, right? So I could expand it to like 28 cases of countries. And they have like standardized data at the individual level when they ask the same questions.
Yeah.
People in all these countries, right? So it allowed me to run the individual level standard classic of political participation model, whereas bringing in the contextual effects. And I did like like not so difficult, like just like standard like multi-level linear model when I had like a random effect at the country level. There was no time effect, and I used the data for the country level indicators. The power separation measure comes from like a database of countries measured in terms of like how the different power centers are like in like contestational relationship to one another, but it also has like aspect of like who controls them. So it comes like from some Henny's measure. It's like political economy measure that people use to predict like stability of markets and whatever stuff I don't understand. But it basically captures like also situation, even if you had like a perfectly power separated situation, like constitution, but something would happen and one party would control all these pieces, it would not count as power separated, right? So this measure combines all this, and he looks at horizontal, vertical, and like one more level of like structure and who holds the power. Yeah. And power sharing, I use indicator of like Tage Perras, like multipartism, effective number of political parties. And then I also looked at corporatism, like in terms of like how, yeah, I didn't mention that, of how like the tripartite and like negotiations with like non-state actors in the state look like. So like tripartite, like the institution of tripartite, like when you have employees, employers, and the state, would also be another example of this like power shared, like joint responsibility type of situation that does not really work in a system of like creating more accountability for their constituents. And the cultural stuff, I measured like how the political culture people do it. It came from World Value Survey, and basically it's like country level aggregation of following the measure of like Engelhardt, and I think it's the book, like the last book that Engelhardt and Belzel wrote, where they look at a percentage of people scoring on their like definition of self-expressive culture, like being a critical citizen. Now I will not remember any of the others. Yeah, but it's like post-materialist types of measures, and social capital is like aggregated membership in groups and social trust.
So if I can just resume it, you actually observed what is presently here, having like on a country level some kind of estimation if a political culture is more like oriented towards consensus or towards competition or contestation. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then basically, and I think it's a really cool model because it allows you to like distinguish the variance. So you can say the same person like me, how much more likely would I be to participate in politics if I was in different contexts, having all my individual characteristics. So you can even like calculate this type of effect from that.
Can you tell me which countries were there? I mean, it's basically some of them were, let's say, more towards one kind of model or political cultures, and the others toward. Can you tell me which countries were, let's say, best representatives of certain models?
So, I mean, the countries that I included is like what I call like Western liberal style democracies, and basically it's all industrial countries, all democracies like New Zealand, Taiwan, US, Canada, Europe, like all these countries. And I have like so there's like some variation in the political institutions, while like some other stuff that would mess up things is excluded. And then there's like a big variation on self-expressive culture. The countries that fit well to the estimate, to this like theory, would be countries like the US, Sweden. That would be like the representatives of the like high scoring ones. And the countries that don't really fit well would be countries like, or are in the middle, would be countries like UK. And countries like, I don't know, Romania, Bulgaria would be at the very bottom. France, Czech Republic, and New Zealand are outliers. They don't fit. Yeah.
Interesting.
So if you, I mean, I think it's like a lesson for if you would like to do qualitative studies. just looking at I have like tables there, or like the predictions for the individual countries. It might be like a good navigation of like, oh, I don't want to study outlier if I want like a typical case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And we have Tanya, the next one in the list.
Hi, and nice to meet you, everybody.
Hey.
So Christina actually asked most of my questions. I was also asking about methodology, but I feel like, and maybe I missed this, so your sort of chart had I am a sociologist, but I've forgotten the terms. I'm sorry.
No.
So your chart had the sort of way it was moving off from the zero table, and it was sort of looking at how your non-electoral participation is happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was actually wondering how specifically you're defining non-electoral participation, because we end up looking at very different things when we're talking about participation within the nation state, and we're talking about consensus in a nation state versus your 3-person feminist group.
Yeah.
And so these are very, and of course, I'm sure you've thought about that. And I was kind of thinking about what is your ideal type state of the inclusive contestation, because you talked a little bit about America possibly being that ideal type, but then also being the elite type. And so, yeah, that's my questions. Thank you.
Awesome. So measurement of participation in here, it's like individual level, and you're like totally right in that it's like different things. But I spent some time in the book to prove that these nuances don't really matter, that there's like really like a general pattern across countries, that even over time, that so the measures were like, that's like a standard measure that you find in the surveys. It's like, did you in last 12 months sign a petition? Did you go to demonstration? Did you and what like problem with this is that it's really rare. So with some of these actions, you have like only like a few % of people. So then it's like national representative survey stops making sense, right? So it doesn't even distinguish like these like topics or like small scale, large scale, because a lot of people don't do nothing, you know? Mm-hmm. So this is like this general kind of like, and people see it like the other classical literature saw it more like, it's not about like counting one thing, two thing and this specific type, but it's more like capturing some more like underlying, more abstract concept of like, does this person do participation or not? No.
Okay.
And yeah, I know it's like this, yeah, but I see that some people might disagree with this, but like if you look at like how this is distributed across countries and especially over time, interesting thing is that there's not so much over time variation in that it's like really like over like last 30 years, like individual countries more or less stay at their level. So there are countries that have like 40% people, but countries that they tend to have 20 over like last 20 years. So there's like something in that is like systematic about those countries that makes individual people living in those countries participate differently to a different extent. Yeah, well, the perfect country, yeah, I mean, I have like love and hate with US. I think the United States, like from the perspective of my book, they score well because they have a lot of participation, but doesn't mean that I'm saying that they're the best democracy and this is how it should work. They have like many other problems, but those problems are not like addressed or captured in the book. But the indicator of like, oh, we have a lot of people participating, this is what they produce. If I should say like my ideal system, I think I would just like dream high and I would say like Rojava, which like if you look at their system, they like hate to hear that, but I think they overlap a lot with what America has in like in terms of how they structure the democratic functioning in there. You know, there's like different ways of like organizing different social groups, everyone, then women, then different ethnic groups, right? And then having like different forms of assemblies and structures. If you look at this, I'm like, hey man, this is totally like power separation a la United States. Of course, like there are like big differences in how it's actually practically done, but the logic, I think, is the same logic. And I think they have really like good way of like applicating it. Yeah.
That's very interesting to hear. I'm sorry, I had meant ideal type in the sort of Weber sense where like you're looking at the person, like this is what this this would be the real life representation of this theoretical concept, but both are good. And yeah, I think within these sort of, we can think about this deliberative democracies being also contesting themselves within these sort of systems which are more actively leftist in some way and more inclusive. But yeah, there's also the sort of like, I think Mauve talks about this frequently, about this sort of a fracturing of ideology in this post-modern sense, and that there isn't like a sort of coherent single thing that people generally want. Not that there necessarily ever was, but when you look at something like Rojava, you're actually seeing people who are kind of coming together as some form of principles that are similar. And so you can have a much different system. And we'll see how it goes. That's it for me. Thank you.
I totally agree with this. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sanya, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, thanks a lot. My first, allow me to be just kind of an observer, because like I'm organizing all this. So my first remark will be that I recognize people coming from different disciplines, either through the vocabulary we are all using, or a methodological approach, or whatsoever. Because one thing is certain, we all here agree on the fact that we are interested and involved into a topic of what the democracy is and what can be brought from this model of being together, like broadest attitude of being together and not being in a family or a partnership or any affective level of togetherness. And so my second step in observing this disciplinarity approach, I thought straight away when you mentioned plurality, I thought of Hannah Arendt, of course, and her way of engaging the plurality as an active, not a participatory. This is the like New Age word, but for her it was like inclusiveness, like conditio, not only as a conditio sine qua non, but within the very condition of necessary condition. This is the starting point. Nothing that we can do without the plurality, thinking plurality. And then plurality not only as plural voices, stances, or whatsoever, but in a structural way. And I'm certain that Valentina Moro can say more about it, because the other step, or the third step that I thought of was Judith Butler and her things and thoughts on the performativity of a people, not the people in a populist way, but again, this plurality, which is not the plurality of Rousseau's mob. You see, you remember reference? So the point, my point will be how we are going to think this plurality within the contestation, but producing a positive thing. Because what the contestation brings is always a kind of a, okay, we know what we are against, but do we articulate what is it that we are for fighting or contesting, etc., etc. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's really perfect. And if I mean, I know nothing about Hannah Arendt, but if I understood correctly, then I love it, and I would love to hear more about this. And yeah, and like the thing that you're saying, that the goal is not to overcome plurality, but to learn to live with it productively, right? And like, if I would connect it like to like also like to empirical literature of like, it's not easy to live plurality, right? Because like also in terms of like political conflict, there's like a lot of research showing that we as people don't seek conflict, right? We want to feel appreciated and nice and safe, and conflict is out of comfort zone, right? So a lot of people also like there's this risk of like that like conflict avoidance means participation avoidance, because like even, okay, so we understand that we are different, we are plural, and we need to have conflict. Even if people accept it, then there's this point of like, yeah, but why would people go through this painful process, right? So like I don't know, like the way of thinking about it would be, they also like, again, like Rojava have this like method of like tech mill, or how they call it, like this like a productive criticism, self-criticism, like thinking of criticism, conflict, and contestation in kind of like a caring and productive way. That it's like that, or like in psychology, like a direct non-aggressive communication, or this like, I guess like these things, okay, I'm going really like off the script now, but like these things talk like, I think, in similar direction, that there can be ways of how we can do conflict in a way that people don't cry, or don't feel like this discomfort. And I think it's also like, think of like habit and practice. Yeah. But if like anyone has like ideas about like, or want to say more about Butler in Hannah Arendt, I would really love to hear that, please.
We'll do it. We'll do it.
Yeah, when you come to React Connexus, for
Also,
example, next year or something. Yeah, and
I'm just
yeah, still okay.
Yeah, Katerina, maybe you might be interested to participate in our seminar in July, because, and Valentina can say a word or, about it. We are going to welcome Bonnie Honey, who did things on agonistic democracies, and she's one of those, not only Chantal Mouffe, but then the other tradition of thinking. Tell us more about it, Valentina.
Thank you. Thank you, Katerina, for the presentation. It was very interesting. And yes, so I invited Bonnie Honig on July 23rd, and she will be presenting her new book on politics of refusal, and it's a feminist theory of politics of refusal. And Butler is definitely part of the book. She is putting Butler in a conversation, agonistic conversation with Agamben, and there's a chapter in which Cavarero is an agonistic conversation with another author. Now I don't remember the table of context, because it is just out. But I just wanted to say something, if I may. I found it very interesting, and especially the example of Rojava, because so for what I know, one of the things which is very meaningful in the assemblies in Rojava is that the very community of Rojava is not considered as being pre-existing to those assemblies, but that very assembly, the very assembly moment, is the moment in which the community is recreated, especially from a feminist perspective. I'm talking about the feminist group and the female assemblies. And one of the things that this aspect highlights is that there's a nexus, which you talked about actually, which is the nexus between the performative nexus between participation and recognition. So self-recognition is a way to somehow to make plurality emerge. Like, we don't need external recognition. We don't need to create a communitarian structure that you recognize as a nation state or as a external entity, but we are building our democracy at our conditions. What do you think about it?
Those are great points. Yeah, like it's basically like democracy without state, right? And citizenship and all this stuff. Yeah, I must say I haven't thought of it in the context of this book or like a classical political science type of perspective. Yeah, but yeah, I can't tell. Yeah, definitely like this recreation of the community, talking about like citizenship and who has right to speak for who and where and when, right? I think this totally would be, I mean, I don't know much about it, like professionally, but this I think would definitely go in the like further direction of what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I would need to think of this more. But yeah, I would love to like implement this in this type of thinking. And yeah, like bringing in Rojava, that's something that I've been more kind of like in my private life, have been thinking of a lot recently. And yeah, I'm still not decided whether we can really have democracy without state, but we will see.
We could bring Hannah Arendt again here, right? On revolution, I think fits nicely, or would fit nicely in this discussion. But we have to leave it, you know, for the time when we all meet in the ECA probably. But you mentioned further directions, and I have here one more short question from Sean, which could lead us to basically your final words. And this question exactly focuses on that. So he would like, and we all would like to hear more something on your later research or directions of your later research, and whether you built on these findings in the book you presented today.
I did like after this was like my PhD project, and like as a following the proper career thing, I did something different for my postdoc. So I did not really develop this much further later, but I'm like I have a paper where I'm using this to talk about like democracy in Eastern Europe, and a little bit like talk to the conversation between like populism and decline of democracy in Eastern Europe. That I think this type of perspective has something productive to say there. Like I'm with like all other people who talk about it like from like a similar perspective, but not like using this type of theoretical framework. Yeah, and like I'm like thinking like a big project for the future, I think would be, I would like to do more on like this like participatory institutions, and especially like now when we have this like things happening and there's like a lot of potential for people getting involved, to look at which specific structures really matter. Because like I see it's like nice to say, oh, having a constitutional court is amazing and this and that, but this is not really what we can do like in everyday life. And I'm like, this is not really helping like individual people somewhere unless we do like something like Rojava. So I think like my future development of this project would be to bring it more like lower level to something that can actually be practically changed.
Okay.
Yeah, so, there's nothing yet.
So these are future plans.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that we are, yes, Sanya, please.
No, after just this nice presentation and all the discussion, I think that there is a ground to work together on certain things. This is just a natural thing that came to my mind. Sorry for interrupting you, Andre.
No, sounds good to me, and I'll be happy to participate if I can. But I think that we are now approaching the end of this seminar, and I'm really grateful that Katka participated, and I really enjoyed it. It was great, and I really mean it. So this is not just like saying that. And I hope that we will find some opportunities to put something together in the future.
Yeah, I also thank you all very much for like spending your time. And if you would like to communicate about this or your work further, or if you think that you have like some interesting stuff that you want to email about or exchange working papers or working progress, or just chat about things, or like even if you're in completely different field, like I would totally love that. Like that we could like, you know, exchange what different perspectives are about and what people are thinking. So yeah, please feel free to get in touch.
Great. That's actually an invitation for you and Sean and others that are not officially part of the group to join us in our seminars that we're having in July as well. And we'll have some great guys like, as I said, Bonnie Honig, but then Glenn Whale from Radical Exchange on 2nd of July, and others. So you're most welcome to check out our Facebook page, and all lectures are open, so everybody's welcome. And thanks a lot to all of you. I wish you all the best for the rest of the day, and see you soon.
Thank you. See you. Bye. Bye.